Some stories sound fabricated, like dark fiction crafted to unsettle the mind. You listen, you doubt, and then you realize they actually happened. This is Final Statement. On December 24th, 2002, the city of Modesto, California, was defined by the quiet rhythm of the holiday season. It was a place where people left their doors unlocked and neighbors knew each other by name. Within this stillness lived 7-year-old Laci Peterson. She was building a life, preparing for the arrival of her son, Connor. Her days were centered around the home, a space meticulously arranged for a future that seemed guaranteed. There were no signs of the fracture to come, no warnings etched into the walls of her residence. To the outside world, the domestic routine remained undisturbed. She moved through the rooms, checking the inventory for the nursery and tending to the small daily tasks that define a normal life. But the calendar was ticking toward a date that would erase that normalcy forever. The silence of that morning held no malice, yet it was the final moment of peace Laci would ever know. This is how the nightmare began. The morning of December 24th dawned with the crisp, cold clarity typical of a Central Valley winter. It was meant to be a day of final preparations and quiet holiday anticipation, but by mid-afternoon, the rhythm of the neighborhood shifted. The front door of the Peterson home stood closed, yet the life inside had ceased its movement. Neighbors noticed the silence first, a lack of the usual activity that marked the household. Then came the discovery. The family dog was found in the backyard, still tethered to its lead, waiting for a walk that never happened. It paced the perimeter of the fence, alert to a presence that had simply ceased to be there. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered glass, no indication of a struggle that would alert the surrounding homes. Just an empty space where a person had been hours before. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the reality of the situation tightened. The phone calls went unanswered, the messages piled up. What began as a day of celebration dissolved into a frantic, sinking realization that the person who anchored this home had vanished into the holiday haze, leaving behind only questions and a growing, cold dread. Before the disappearance became a tragedy, it was a portrait of stability. Friends and neighbors spoke of a couple that appeared to be the bedrock of the neighborhood. They were preparing for the arrival of their first son, Connor, with a level of focus that impressed those around them. The nursery was complete, the final touches applied to a room designed for a future that was never meant to be. Laci was frequently seen in the community, her life orbiting the expectation of motherhood. Scott was viewed as a committed partner, actively participating in the preparations that define a new family. To the outside observer, there were no cracks in the foundation, no friction in their shared routine. This makes the sudden void even more piercing. When the news of Laci's vanishing broke, it sent a shockwave through the city. People who had seen them together only days prior struggled to reconcile the image of a happy, expectant household with the reality of an empty home. The community organized searches, driven by the belief that a life so carefully built could not simply evaporate. They looked for clues in the parks, along the roads, and in the faces of anyone who might have seen them. But the more they looked, the more the silence of that house seemed to mock their efforts. While the community searched for signs of a missing woman, the foundation of Scott's life was already fractured by deliberate, calculated choices. In November, weeks before the silence fell over the Modesto home, he established a secondary reality in Fresno. He initiated contact with Amber Frey, a massage therapist, and began a campaign of systematic deception. He navigated this parallel path with precision, keeping the two spheres of his existence strictly separated. When he was with his family, he maintained the facade of an expectant father. When he moved to Fresno, he discarded that identity entirely. He spent his hours crafting a narrative of isolation, positioning himself as a man who existed outside of his real-world commitments. This was not a sudden lapse or a single mistake. It was a sustained effort to build a life that did not include his wife or their unborn son. He laid the groundwork for his absence long before the calendar reached December 24th. Every interaction with Amber was a brick in a wall he was building between his domestic obligations and the version of himself he wanted to present to her. The cracks were not visible to the outside world, but they were wide, deep, and growing with every passing day. The deception soon moved from silence to spoken words. In his conversations with Amber Frey, Scott began to sculpt a narrative that replaced his actual life with a dark fiction. He spoke to her as if he were a man unburdened by a marriage, a man without a home to return to each night. He told her he was single, but he went further, crafting a lie that would later resonate with terrifying clarity. He told Amber that he had lost his wife. He spoke of this loss in the past tense, as if the event had already occurred, setting the stage for a future he was actively orchestrating. He explicitly told her that he would be spending his first Christmas alone, a calculated move to secure her sympathy and solidify his position in her life. This was not merely an affair. It was a rehearsal for a reality he intended to bring into existence. He was describing a death that had not yet happened, positioning himself as a widower while Laci was still walking the halls of their home. Every word he fed her was a countdown. He was living in the present while speaking from a future where his wife was gone, effectively narrating the tragedy before the first day of December had even reached its end. The morning of December 24th arrived with a pre-planned narrative. Scott informed the authorities that he had departed at 9:30 a.m., bound for the Berkeley Marina. His stated objective was a solo fishing trip, a journey requiring a 90-mile drive from their home. It was a detail designed to place him far from the center of events during the critical hours of the day. Investigators initially accepted the timeline, but the physical evidence began to diverge from his story. They discovered that Scott had secretly acquired an aluminum boat in the weeks prior. This was not a tool he had owned or shared with his family. It was an acquisition kept strictly private, unknown even to those closest to him. The purchase lacked any logical explanation within the context of his daily routine. As detectives probed the timeline of his trip, the significance of that hidden vessel became impossible to ignore. He had constructed an alibi based on a destination nearly 100 miles away, yet he had equipped himself with a specific piece of equipment that suggested a different purpose entirely. The fishing trip was not a casual excursion. It was a carefully staged maneuver, providing him the mobility and the isolation he needed to execute his plan. At 4:30 p.m., the front door of the Peterson residence remained shut. When Scott arrived back from the marina, the silence of the neighborhood was absolute. He walked toward the backyard, expecting the usual routine of a late afternoon. Instead, he found the family dog wandering loose, still dragging its leash through the grass. The sight was immediate, jarring, and wrong. A leash left on usually meant someone had intended to take the animal for a walk, or perhaps had been interrupted mid-departure. Scott scanned the perimeter, but there was no movement. He moved toward the house, testing the handle. The door was unlocked. Inside, the quiet was heavy, lacking the normal sounds of a home preparing for the evening. Every room he checked was vacant. Surfaces were undisturbed, but the space felt hollow. There was no sign of a struggle, yet the total absence of Laci created an immediate, suffocating tension. He moved from the kitchen to the living area, calling out into the stillness, but only his own voice echoed back. The groceries were untouched. The house was cold. Laci was simply gone, leaving behind a domestic scene that had been halted in time, signaling that something had severed the ordinary flow of the day. When the police arrived that evening, the expectation of a frantic husband was replaced by a sterile, unsettling quiet. Scott sat in the living room as officers swept through the property. He did not rise to meet them. He did not offer information about where Laci might have gone or who she might have seen that day. His posture remained static, his eyes tracking the officers with a detached, rhythmic focus. When a detective approached him to ask for details about the last time he had seen his wife, Scott offered no struggle, no tears, and no questions. He provided the timeline of his fishing trip with a rehearsed precision that felt entirely removed from the reality of a missing pregnant woman. There was a profound absence of desperation in his demeanor. He did not plead for them to search harder. He did not pace the floor or demand updates on their progress. To the investigators, the atmosphere in the room felt heavy with a disconnect that defied human instinct. He remained anchored in his chair, watching the search unfold with the steady, unblinking patience of a spectator. Every minute that passed without him asking a single question about Laci's location deepened the growing suspicion among the men in the room. As the search for Laci expanded into the community, the distance between Scott and those looking for her widened into a chasm. Volunteers spent their daylight hours scouring parks and fields, their faces tight with the strain of the unknown. When Scott appeared at these gatherings, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Observers noted he did not join the coordinated efforts or organized teams. Instead, he stood apart, observing the group with a detachment that bordered on amusement. At one point, witnesses saw him laughing during the briefing, his voice cutting through the somber intensity of the crowd. The sound was jarring, triggering an immediate ripple of unease among the family and neighbors. The divide grew sharper when investigators asked him to submit to a polygraph test. A standard procedure to clear a spouse, it was met with a flat, unwavering rejection. He provided no explanation for the refusal, simply closing the door on the request. His actions became a series of deliberate choices that placed him outside the circle of the grieving. He was present in the room, yet entirely removed from the urgency of the search. By distancing himself from the very people trying to bring his wife home, he transformed from a husband in crisis into the primary subject of the investigation. The disconnect between Scott and the search for his wife soon bled into his private actions at home. While the community held vigils, Scott moved with a different, more clinical agenda. Within weeks of the disappearance, he listed Laci's vehicle for sale. He handled the transaction with routine efficiency, meeting potential buyers to finalize the transfer of keys and title. The empty space in the driveway did not seem to register as a loss, but as a clearance of inventory. His focus then shifted to the interior of the house. He entered the room intended for the baby and began the process of dismantling the life they had prepared. He packed away the items, cleared the surfaces, and moved the furniture out piece by piece. There was no hesitation in his movements. He worked through the nursery with the same detached precision he had shown during his police interviews. Each object he removed felt like a deliberate strike against the reality of the child who was never born. Neighbors noticed the activity, the steady stream of items leaving the house, and the growing emptiness of the rooms. He was not waiting for her return. He was systematically erasing the evidence that she had ever lived there at all. The silence surrounding the house did not last. In January 2003, the framework of Scott's double life began to fracture. A woman named Amber Frey reached out to investigators, bringing with her a narrative that contradicted every public statement Scott had made to the police. She was a massage therapist who had entered into a relationship with him weeks before the disappearance. During their time together, he had maintained a persistent fabrication. He told her he was a widower. He described the supposed loss of his wife with practiced gravity, claiming that he would be facing his first Christmas alone. These details were not just whispers. They were recorded facts that shattered the image of the grieving husband. When the police received this information, the focus of the investigation shifted instantly. They were no longer looking for a man who had lost his wife, but for a man who had created a secondary reality to escape his own life. The detectives began to map the timeline of his deception, contrasting the dates of his affair against the days of the search. The web of lies was no longer theoretical. It was documented, verified, and impossible to ignore. For the first time, the investigators had a motive that reached beyond the house in Modesto. The investigation became a game of shadows, with police listening to every word Scott uttered. They monitored his phone, recording hours of conversations that exposed a man operating in two distinct worlds. In one, he was the devoted husband, present at public vigils where community members held candles in the freezing night air. In the other, he was the lover, crafting elaborate fantasies to maintain his hold on Amber Frey. During one recorded call, Scott spoke with calm, deliberate confidence, telling her he was in Paris. He described the sounds of the city, the atmosphere of the streets, and the loneliness of his travels. In reality, investigators watched him from their vehicles, parked mere blocks from his home. He was not in France. He was standing in the dark, participating in a search for the wife he had already discarded. The detectives listened to his voice, smooth and unbothered, as he painted a picture of a man thousands of miles away. It was a performance of breathtaking audacity. He was crafting a new life, while the embers of the old one were still being sought by search parties. The discrepancy between his words and his location served as the final proof. He was not just lying to the police. He was actively rewriting the narrative of his own life while the truth waited in the shadows. April 2003 arrived with a brutal finality that no amount of surveillance could have predicted. The search, which had spanned months of speculation and public vigils, took a sharp, jagged turn. On the shoreline of the San Francisco Bay, a passerby spotted something in the surf. It was not debris. It was a person. Within hours, a second discovery was made only a short distance away. The locations were chillingly specific. They were found just miles from the Berkeley Marina. This was the exact site where Scott claimed to have been fishing on the day of the disappearance. The water had held these secrets for months, shielded by the currents and the vastness of the bay. Now, the ocean was returning what had been taken. Investigators cordoned off the coastline, their lights cutting through the twilight as they recovered the remains. The air was cold, smelling of salt and decay, a stark contrast to the sterile, calculated lies Scott had woven for months. The distance between his alibi and the reality of the crime scene had effectively collapsed. What had been a missing persons case was now a crime scene of impossible gravity. The nightmare that had been whispered about in every home in Modesto had finally materialized on the shore, leaving no room for further deception. The samples were rushed to the state laboratory under heavy guard. Scientists worked through the night, their movements precise and devoid of the chaos that gripped the outside world. Every hour that passed felt like a countdown. Then, the results arrived. The genetic markers were an absolute match. The remains belonged to Laci Peterson and her unborn son, Connor. There was no room for error, no margin for hope. The news rippled out from the precinct, hitting the Peterson family with the force of a physical blow. The missing persons investigation ended in that single, sterile moment. It was replaced by a double murder inquiry. The case, which had been built on suspicious behavior and broken alibis, now had its foundation in the cold reality of forensic science. Police moved with renewed intensity, gathering evidence that linked the bodies to the crime. For the families involved, the confirmation was a final, devastating threshold. The questions of where she might be, or what might have happened, were silenced by the permanence of the findings. The search was over. The hunt for justice had begun. The reality of the tragedy was now written in DNA, leaving everyone to face the absolute, irreversible truth of what had occurred on that December morning. The investigation turned into a high-stakes pursuit. Police intelligence tracked Scott to a golf course just miles from the Mexican border near San Diego. He was not the man who had sat in the living room in Modesto. His hair had been bleached to a stark, unnatural shade. A thick goatee masked the lower half of his face. He moved across the green with a calculated, low-profile focus, unaware that the net had already tightened. Authorities swerved onto the property, their vehicles blocking his exit. When they searched his car, the full extent of his planning became clear. They found $15,000 in cash, tucked away in hidden compartments. Multiple cell phones lay on the seat, ready to be activated or discarded. There was survival gear, maps, and enough provisions to vanish entirely. He had not been mourning. He had been preparing for an exit. The facade of the grieving husband dissolved completely in the face of his own flight preparations. He had been hours away from crossing the border, ready to leave his life behind for good. The law had caught him in the final, desperate act of a man who knew the walls were closing in. The pursuit ended on that sun-drenched course, leaving no doubt about his guilt. The courtroom became a theater of cold evidence. Prosecutors laid out a timeline that dismantled every claim of innocence. They focused on the days leading up to December 24th, presenting a calculated sequence of events. At the center of their case were the objects recovered from the bay floor. They were not standard marine equipment. They were homemade concrete anchors, crafted with intent. The prosecution demonstrated how these tools were designed to keep a body submerged, preventing discovery by the tides. Each block of concrete represented a deliberate step in a plan that had begun long before the disappearance. Scott sat in the gallery, his face a mask of detachment that contradicted the gravity of the testimony. Every witness brought forward reinforced the same image: a man who had meticulously prepared for the disposal of his own family. The state argued that this was not a crime of passion or a sudden mistake, but a patient, systematic execution. They detailed his movements, the timing of his boat trips, and the specific construction of the weights. The jury watched as the prosecution turned scientific data and construction materials into a portrait of a calculated killer. The defense struggled to find purchase against the weight of the physical evidence, while the gallery sat in silence, forced to process the level of premeditation involved in the final, dark chapter of the Peterson household. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted when Amber Frey took the stand. She was the witness who would finally break the wall of silence. She did not just offer testimony, she brought the truth of their secret life into the open. The prosecution hit play, and the muffled sound of a telephone call echoed through the room. It was Scott. His voice was light, casual, and entirely detached from the reality of the missing woman. In the recording, he spoke of his future, his plans, and his affection for Amber, while the public search for Laci was at its absolute peak. He laughed at a joke she made. The sound was jarring, a stark betrayal of the grieving husband he had presented to the world. Jurors leaned forward, their expressions hardening as the recordings continued to play. One call after another documented his duplicity, revealing a man who was actively building a new life while the old one was being discarded in the bay. He had been flirting, planning, and lying, his voice steady and devoid of any remorse. The tapes provided an undeniable look at his character, shattering any remaining doubt about his motivations. The courtroom remained frozen, the only sound being the playback of his own words, condemning him with every sentence. The final arguments concluded, and the jury retreated to decide the fate of a man who had left no room for doubt. For days, the courthouse existed in a state of suspended animation. Reporters crowded the halls, and the public waited for the signal that a decision had been reached. Then, the word came down. The jury had returned. The courtroom filled with a heavy, suffocating silence as everyone took their seats. Scott stood as the foreman rose, holding the slips of paper that would define the rest of his life. The judge signaled for the verdict to be read. The words were delivered with clinical precision. Guilty of first-degree murder for Laci, guilty of second-degree murder for Connor. The room did not erupt. It simply collapsed under the weight of the pronouncement. There was no sound of protest from the defense table. Only the steady, rhythmic ticking of the courtroom clock marked the transition from accusation to final judgment. The reality of the crime had been stripped of all pretense, leaving behind only the cold, legal truth of what happened on that December night. As the jury was polled, each member confirmed the decision, closing the chapter on the search, the lies, and the investigation. The trial was over, and the long, painful process of accountability had begun. The legal system did not stop at the verdict. In 2005, a judge handed down the sentence of death, a conclusion many expected given the nature of the crime. For 15 years, that was the standing reality of the case. Then, in 2020, the foundation of that sentence cracked. An appeals court reviewed the proceedings and identified errors during the jury selection process. As a direct result, the death sentence was vacated and replaced with life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom doors closed on that chapter, but the case remained active in the shadows. By 2024, the Innocence Project began a formal review of the evidence, bringing new scrutiny to the trial that had gripped the nation decades prior. These legal shifts kept the case in constant motion, moving through courts and reviews while the man at the center of it all stayed behind bars. The machinery of the law continued to grind, processing motions and appeals long after the initial headlines had faded from public view. Each shift in the legal status served as a reminder that the judicial process is never truly static. Even when the underlying facts remain unchanged, the case moved forward, not toward a new resolution, but through a cycle of re-examination that continued to define his existence within the prison walls. The legal motions and court files represent only the machinery of justice, not the measure of the life that was stolen. Laci Peterson was 27 years old when she vanished. Her son, Connor, never drew a single breath. Behind the news cycles and the courtroom transcripts, a family remains trapped in the silence of their absence. Every Christmas Eve, the calendar returns to the date that dismantled their world, and the loss remains as sharp as it was in 2002. No verdict, no appeal, and no legal review can restore the life that was taken or fill the space left in their home. The case has become a record of evidence and procedure, but for those who knew her, the reality is far simpler and far more devastating. Laci and Connor exist now only in memory, separated from the noise of the headlines. Some stories sound like fiction until the weight of the tragedy settles in. This has been Final Statement. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and share it. These victims deserve to be remembered, and their names deserve to outlast the man who took them.